Hello, I'm Terry Hamburg, and welcome to Cypress Lawn Memorial Park, the home of some 500,000 souls, and each one has a story. Today we're going to look at two important California families, the DeYoungs and the Spreckels, the families that are responsible for building the two great museums of San Francisco, the Legion of Honor and the DeYoung. We call this Murder, Mayhem, and Museums. Right now, we're standing under a larger-than-life statue of Charles DeYoung, a man who loomed large over early San Francisco. As a young man, Charles moved to San Francisco with his family from Louisiana, and in 1865, he and his brother started a newspaper that was called the Daily Dramatic Chronicle, where he reported on show business and theater news, and then it quickly evolved into the San Francisco Chronicle that we know today. This statue was built by his brother and originally placed with DeYoung in the Oddfellows Cemetery and moved to Cypress Lawn in 1947. You'll notice the dates on Charles' stone. He died as a very young man, age 34. So how does this happen? In Gold Rush San Francisco, you either died from an illness, which today there would probably be a cure, or by the bullet. In the case of Charles DeYoung, as it turns out, that pen he is holding in his hand was not mightier than the sword. Charles DeYoung was a determined man. He was short-tempered, aggressive, and wanted to pursue anti-corruption and expose stories. 6 years after the newspaper was founded, he had already been sued 12 times for criminal libel. And one of his enemies decided not to go through the court system at all, but to challenge him directly to a duel, which the two of them fought on a busy California street. And they each discharged 2 volleys, which fortunately missed each other, and even more miraculously missed the audience that had gathered or was fleeing from the spectacle. Charles DeYoung actually enjoyed the notoriety he was getting and seemed to thrive off the danger and the excitement. He was told to pack a pistol, and he did. His newspaper wasn't afraid of controversy either. Journalism was a blood sport in the early gold rush. The best example of this is in 1856, an editor of a prominent newspaper is assassinated by the editor of another prominent newspaper. The culprit is then tried by a vigilance committee and publicly hung 8 days later. This is the world that Charles DeYoung inherited. In 1880, Charles DeYoung is locking horns with the largest minister in the city, both in terms of weight and congregation size. Reverend Isaac Kaylock is going to run for mayor. DeYoung thinks this is a terrible idea. He's unworthy, he's corrupt, and DeYoung has his own candidate. After Kaylock is nominated, DeYoung decides he has to stop him. He runs a series of articles accusing Kaylock of serial adultery. This had a certain plausibility because the Reverend was known to fancy the company of young ladies. In DeYoung's article, he starts naming names and dates and places, some of which may even have been true. Kaylock would not back down. In fact, he was emboldened by this, and he decided to answer DeYoung in public in front of his congregation. Yes, he admitted, I was accused of being a philanderer, of adultery, when I was a young lad, but I went to court and I was acquitted. Then Reverend Kaylock turned his attention to the DeYoung brothers. And I'm going to read a bit of his sermon. It is not necessary tonight, it may be hereafter, to discuss the defiled organ. And he's talking about the San Francisco Chronicle. The bawdy house breeding, the gutter snipe training of this delectable pair of social pariahs, the DeYoung brothers, who are moral lepers, vainly struggling for the recognition which decent society denies them, and who, by a persistent, damnable system of blackmailing, have built up a newspaper which, in its every issue, is a moral volcano. So this was the poetry of the pulpit and the printing press. And I want to call your attention to one little part of it, the bawdy house breeding. What does that mean? It meant that the DeYoungs were bastards, in a literal sense. We may know who their mother is because she was in a bawdy house, but we don't know who the father was. Well, DeYoung's attitude was, you can attack me, but don't attack my mother. And this drove him to a frenzy. So he could have challenged the Reverend to a duel. The guy was big and probably slow, but he decided against that. Duels can be inconclusive. So instead, he devised a simple but dastardly plan. He enlisted the aid of a young lad to find Kaylock, lure Kaylock to a coach to speak to a young lady. As Kaylock approached the coach, DeYoung flung open the door and fired 2 shots, point blank, at Kaylock, who falls to the ground. He's immediately arrested and brought to jail. An engraving of the crime scene, very lurid and detailed, is splashed across newspapers around the country. It shows Kaylock grabbing his chest, DeYoung firing the weapon, smoke coming from his gun. Once the San Francisco newspapers got it, the national press got it, and then international papers. An early 19th century example of going viral. Kaylock is down, but he's not out. With enough natural insulation to stop any bullet from penetrating vital organs, he actually goes on and he lives. Believe it or not, lo and behold, he goes on to be elected mayor while he is still in bed recovering from his wound. DeYoung is in jail, but this doesn't stop him. He continues his anti-Kaylock diatribe until he is released on bail. Reverend Kaylock has a son, Isaac Jr., and he is horrified by what's going on. The DeYoungs are destroying his family, almost killed his father, and Charles DeYoung must be stopped. So he picks a night. Charles DeYoung is sitting in his office in the brand new Chronicle building, and Kaylock sits across the street at a tavern drinking liquid courage. He walks into DeYoung's office, pulls out his gun, and starts firing. 3 shots hit DeYoung. DeYoung is still alive. He reaches for his pistol, and the final shot by Isaac pierces his jugular, and Charles DeYoung is dead. Immediately, Isaac Kaylock is arrested and brought to jail. At a young 34 years old, Charles DeYoung, one of the most successful editors in the West and known worldwide, is dead. His family has a service 2 days later, and then, in venerable San Francisco tradition, a lavish public funeral attended by thousands. So young Isaac Kaylock goes to trial. It seems like an open and shut case, but when the verdict comes back, it is a surprise. We find the defendant innocent, Your Honor. He was acting under extreme duress and temporarily insane at the time of the assault. There is public outrage, which is mild compared to the editorial outrage, especially from Michael DeYoung. Eventually, the case fades away, but the DeYoung story doesn't end here. In In 1884, a few years after the K-Lock incident, Michael DeYoung, who has taken over the newspaper from Charles, is writing a series of strong anti-corruption, anti-monopoly articles against one of the most powerful families in California, the Spreckels family. Klaus Spreckels is known as the Sugar King. And it just so happens that he is right up the road, around the corner from the DeYoungs. And here we have it, the spectacular Klaus Spreckels Mausoleum. So here we are at the beautiful, magnificent Spreckels Mausoleum, one of my favorites. It's perched on a hill overlooking all of the terrain. It's sort of the Pacific Heights of Cypress Lawn. And it also has openings on all four sides. So inside, it's light and airy, unlike any other mausoleum here. But we're not here to talk about architecture. Starting from nothing, Klaus Spreckels became one of the wealthiest men in the world by building a monopoly of the sugar trade from the Hawaiian Islands. He established a series of plantations and then a shipping system to bring the sugar to the western United States. This shipping system was led by a young William Matson, who went on later in life when tourism became popular in Hawaii to establish the Matson passenger steamship lines. But that's a story for another time. The power of the Spreckels family made them prime targets for an anti-corruption Michael DeYoung. He begins by accusing them of running slave labor on their Hawaiian plantations. When DeYoung accused him of bilking his stockholders, his young son Adolf was livid. He was ruining the family, ruining their reputation, and he decided to stop DeYoung. His aim was to silence him, to cut off any more articles from ever being published. But unlike Isaac K-Lock's son, his aim was off. He marches into the Chronicle offices, finds Michael DeYoung, pulls out a gun, and fires a shot. The first one wings him in the elbow. The second one hits him in the shoulder. By this time, the employees hear the ruckus, come running in, see Adolf, and begin to tackle him. Adolf manages to get off a third shot, and Michael, who was carrying children's books at the time, holds them up as defense. The bullet goes through the children's book, but still penetrates Michael. In the course of being tackled to the ground, Adolf is shot. Well, when all of the gunpowder settles, both men, although wounded, were still alive. Young Adolf goes to trial, and the jury comes back with its verdict. Innocent. He was acting under extreme duress, and you can fill in the blank, was temporarily insane at the time of the assault. It's a good thing that both of these men survived this incident. Good for fine arts in San Francisco. Some years later, Michael DeYoung, possibly to improve his reputation, decided to establish the Fine Arts Building in Golden Gate Park, which was damaged in the earthquake of 1906, restored, renovated with DeYoung funds, and the museum was renamed appropriately the DeYoung Museum. In San Francisco, philanthropy was a competitive sport. And this is a sport that Adolf is ready to follow. Years later, after the incident, he marries a beautiful, young, tall, statuesque, risque model named Alma de Bretteville. Alma had very expensive tastes, especially in fine art, and especially in French art, and especially in Rodin sculptures, which she introduced to the United States. She was more than just a collector, she was a connoisseur. Finally, they had collected so much fine stuff in so many fine rooms, they had no place else to put it. So Alma filled this new museum with all of her treasures from all over the world. And it opened to great fanfare as the Legion of Honor in 1924. Years later, Alma de Bretteville is at a society luncheon, and in walk the de Young daughters. They manage a strained nod to each other. And Alma turns to her companion and says, "Those de Young girls are nice enough, but they've never forgiven my husband for shooting their father." So here we have this strange historical irony. On a fateful day in 1884, two men who will go on to found the two great museums in San Francisco are in the same room, one trying to kill the other, both of them shot, and both of them surviving. Today, both of these museums, the Legion of Honor and the de Young, in their original locations are equal parts of the Fine Arts Museums of San Francisco, a collaboration which would have been unimaginable back in the day. This is Terry Hamburg. This is Cypress Lawn, and thank you for joining us today.